This is my grandma Fonnesbeck telling a story from the history books about Peter Mon, one of our ancestors who helped settle the valley.
Are we going?
Yeah.
Okay. This is about when they first settled the valley. Chief Bear Hunter was mean. It says he was probably the most vicious and treacherous Indian of all those who visited Cache Valley in the early days. They stole horses from people and caused all kinds of problems. But Peter Mon was instructed not to take things that the Indians could use, like fish and game. They were supposed to buy things from the Indians, so the Indians wouldn't feel like the white men were taking what was theirs, and it gave them a way to survive. But the Indians would come to people's houses and get food from them. Mary Ann Weston Mon, who was, I don't think she was Peter's wife. He had a son named William H. Mon, and I think she was his wife. No, this was probably Peter Mon's wife. Anyway, she said, my neighbor brother John Wood was a mile distant, and I was alone with the children. Some Indians were camped on the bottoms not far away. They were very bold and impudent. Sometimes 4 or 5 or more would get into my house. She had a one-room house. And they would not leave until she had fried their frog legs with butter for them. She said, one morning 2 Indians were coming in the house before I saw them. I tried to shut the door and caught one of them's head between the door and the post. He was very angry and swore that he would go and shoot my son Charles, who was herding cattle. I told them if they did that, the white men would shoot them all, so they didn't end up hurting Charles. But I remember even when my grandma Mon was alive, the Indians would come to her house and ask for food. And she gave them food. She didn't mind doing that at all, and I think everybody gave them food. Because by the time my grandma Mon was alive, they weren't just roaming as free people through the valley, and they weren't hurting anybody anymore. They were just there, and they actually by that time needed help. But it says also in here that in 1862 a large band of Indians camped east of Wellsville on the flats. They knew that the Indians were unfriendly because there was a large band of warriors in Main Street, and they began a dance with blood-curdling yells and weapons. And Bishop Mon, Peter Mon, sent a messenger in haste for their chief bear hunter, who claimed that the Indians were a heap hungry. A committee was immediately appointed to gather up flour and beef to feed them. Every man in Wellsville contributed save one, and he was severely reprimanded and forced to ask for forgiveness. Anyway, they raised 100 pounds of flour, and 2 beef cattle. And the cattle were $50. They were valued at $50 a head then. So the Indians were taken care of, and they left without any trouble. But it made people feel good that they were pacified that easily. But they attacked people all over the valley for several years after people settled the valley. Anyway, there's a story of how Peter Mon his life was spared. So the easiest way I'm just going to read it. How's that?
Yeah, that'll work.
Because that'll be the best.
Yeah.
Okay. In the early settlement of Cache Valley, it became necessary for the settlers to set aside and protect certain sections of land used as pastures and hayland. And they had to have pastures and hayland because the winters were so bad that the cattle, they found out the cattle couldn't feed here in the winter. They had to feed them.
Mm-hmm.
Because there were few, if any, field fences, loose cattle and horses were herded on the less productive grasslands in order that the settlers might secure for their stock hay for winter consumption. One day in the early part of June in 1862, one of the community herders rode into Logan and reported to Bishop Peter Mon that a large band of Indians had camped upon the hay meadows west of town, and they couldn't get them to move. Bishop Mon sent 3 Minutemen with the herder back to the Indian camp, with instructions to use all peaceable means to move the camp off the hayland, and if they wouldn't move, to come back and tell him. So the Minutemen found Chief Bear Hunter and his band, numbering about 100 men, women, and children, camped on a choice section of hayland, and they were pasturing their horses and cattle and destroying the land that the settlers expected to feed the hay off of for the following winter. And they couldn't get them to move. So they went back and told Bishop Mon, who called about 50 Minutemen, and all proceeded to the place where the Indian camp was. The frontiersmen, well mounted and armed, prepared to execute their demands and protect their lives, and it must have impressed the Indians that they were serious. Arriving at the camp, Bishop Mon, through his interpreter, Israel Clark, asked Bear Hunter and his braves to sit in a council. With some reluctance, Bear Hunter finally agreed to talk. Bishop Mon, addressing the Indians, said, "We have come into this valley to make our homes, have come to live among you, and want to be your friends. We must have hay for our stock in the winter. We do not want you to camp on our haylands, when all around you there is feed for your horses, good campgrounds, plenty of game, and meat for your families. You must go." Chief Bear Hunter hated the white men and had sworn in his heart to rid the country of the settlers, because he looked upon them as intruders. The old chief said at once, "We will not go. This valley belongs to the Indians. We own the grass, the water, the fish, and the game. The white man must go." Bishop Mon arose and, facing the chief, said, "We have spoken. You must leave. We will give you 2 hours to move off of our hayland." The Minutemen returned to Logan, but they stayed as a group. They left people to watch the movements of the Indians, and they were hoping that this would end peacefully. Just as the sun was setting, it was reported that the Indians had broken camp and moved on to the river bottoms. The settlers had learned by experience to keep the Indian at arm's length, deal with him kindly but firmly, and avoid everything that would provoke him to violence. But they remembered Cromwell's advice to his soldiers when he said, "Trust in God and keep your powder dry." Therefore a strong guard was placed around the settlement that night, for fear the revengeful Bear Hunter might decide to attack the settlers after nightfall. When morning came the following day, the settlers were relieved that the Indians hadn't caused any trouble, and the events of the previous day might have soon been forgotten, but the movements of Chief Bear Hunter caused the whole affair to be riveted in the settlers' minds for many years to come. Bishop Mon lived in a 2-room log cabin in the eastern part of Logan. He had set 2 wooden pegs in the log wall high over the mantel in his home, upon which rested a rifle of the cap and ball type, which was common in those days. Shortly after breakfast on the day following the visit to the camp of Chief Bear Hunter, he was prompted to take the rifle down from the wall and step to the window for closer examination. In this position, the muzzle of the gun pointed directly toward the front door. While in the act of examining the rifle in this position, to his utter amazement and surprise, the front door was violently pushed upon, and in stepped Bear Hunter unannounced with rifle in hand. The Indian stopped abruptly, bewilderment written on his face. The white chief had him covered. The man he hated had been forewarned. Who had warned him? The Indian had not breathed to a living soul his determination to kill Peter Mon. The 2 men stood staring at each other in astonishment for a few seconds. Then the Indian turned and left the house as abruptly as he had entered. Not a word was spoken. Bear Hunter mounted his horse and disappeared in the dense willow brush of the Logan River bottoms. Bishop Mon always recognized the interposition of the Almighty in saving his life. It was a narrow escape, and he well knew it. The news of Bear Hunter's visit to Bishop Mon's home spread through the settlement, and men became anxious about the movements of the Indians. Guards were sent to watch and report. And a visit to the camp revealed no great excitement, but the reason for the visit of Chief Bear Hunter to Peter Mon's home was made plain. After the Minutemen had left the camp on the previous day, the Indians sat in council, and a large majority of Bear Hunter's braves had opposed his idea of camping on the settlers' hayland. Finally, they overruled his decision and moved on to the river bottom. This so humiliated the chief that he determined to kill Peter Mon, because he thought Bishop Mon had influenced his braves against him. He sought out the bishop with murder in his heart, only to find that the Great Spirit had warned the white chief and revealed what was in the Indian's heart. Humiliated and downcast, he returned to his camp and made an attempt to take his own life, which was prevented by his own people. And then it just talks about how vicious Chief Bear Hunter was, and that he directed the Indian fight in Providence Canyon. And it says the Indians, the white people recovered a white child stolen by the Indians. And Chief Bear Hunter was killed in Idaho in 1863. And then there was the Chief Washakie that they had problems with too. But anyway, they really tried to get along with the Indians. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. But that was a great story about how Peter Mon was protected.
That's really cool.
Do you think you need more than that?
No, that's enough.